I want to thank you for coming today to the Northwest Universal Design Council's Forum on Universal Design and Public Wayfinding. I'm Tom Minty. I'm one of the founding members of the Northwest Universal Design Council. And I'd like to thank our sponsors today, just to acknowledge them. The King County Mobility Coalition, Age-Friendly Seattle, Rooted in Rights, as well as the organizations that are going to be represented today on our panel. The Washington State Deafblind Citizens, Lighthouse for the Blind, Applied Wayfinding, the Seattle Department of Transportation, and Sound Transit. Just as a matter of homekeeping, in case of emergency, the exits are that way and the restrooms are that way as well. Over here we've got the refreshment table, so if you need water or coffee or anything else, it's right over there.
Just say which way that way is.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That way would be east, to your right. Okay. In case of an earthquake, I guess we got to do that now. You know, drop and cover, and we won't be running out of here in a panic. I would also like to stress that when we have questions this afternoon, please use the microphone. You know, even if you think you've got a big booming voice, that doesn't help people that have a hearing impairment. So use the microphones, and we're also recording this with the Seattle channel as well. So that's important that they record your voice on that. The Universal Design Council was really kind of created to help promote and educate the concept of universal design. Universal design really is not guidelines for accessibility, but rather a set of 7 principles that really says that not just in our built environment, but also in education and digital communications, that things need to be designed with those principles so that they're usable by the greatest number of people possible, regardless of abilities or age. Today we're going to have Stacy Huber as our moderator. Stacy's the mobility manager for, which means that she improves transportation and solves transportation problems. For the past 4 years, she has provided staff support for the King County Mobility Coalition, which is a group of community transportation providers and advocates for improved mobility for all. Her work with the coalition involves exclusive planning and collaboration project management. She also happens to be a member of our Northwest Universal Design Steering Council. And I want to thank again the King County Mobility Coalition for their sponsorship of today's event and for supporting Stacy in all of this important work. So without taking up a lot more of your time, I'd like to introduce Stacy Huber.
Thank you, Tom. My goal is really just to introduce the speakers, so I'll get to that in just a moment. But good afternoon, everyone. As Tom said, my name is Stacy Haber, and I'm the Director of Mobility Management at HopeLink, and also provide staff support to the King County Mobility Coalition, but also in partnership with my colleague Cassidy, who's in the front row. So you might have seen her around as well. So the King County Mobility Coalition is thrilled to co-sponsor this event. We want to be able to provide a platform for integrating universal design principles with wayfinding and the built environment. Our vision is a coordinated transportation system in which all people can move freely around King County and the Puget Sound region. In order to move freely, one needs to consider the complete trip and all the components that come with it to make sure there's no barriers from your home to the pedestrian environment, to the bus stop or station, back to the pedestrian environment, and then ultimately to your final destination. So without adequate wayfinding systems, individuals of all ages or abilities might not be able to have the tools to navigate our often complex built environment. So thankfully, there's a lot of solutions and a lot of great case studies that leverage universal design principles in order to ensure wayfinding aids in the successful complete trip. So our speakers today will have a wealth of knowledge to share with you. So I'm just gonna read off their bios, and then they'll go one by one and have about 15 minutes each, and then we'll do Q&A at the very end. David Miller is a certified orientation and mobility specialist at Lighthouse for the Blind. David has worked for close to 30 years developing curriculum and providing instruction around transportation access for blind and deafblind consumers in the multimodal King, Pierce, and Snohomish County transit systems. He has been actively involved in consultation with departments of transportation in implementing ADA standards, as well as with transit agencies and urban designers in understanding and implementing accessibility programs with the goal of creating pedestrian-friendly environments for all. Deborah is deafblind and moved to Seattle in 2015. She really appreciates the city life after growing up on a farm in Montana and Iowa. So different wayfinding there. She graduated from Galante University with a BA in psychology and currently does various contract work related to deafblind culture and educating others as a deafblind mentor. She's a proud mother of 2 grown children. That's Deborah. The next speaker will be Adrian Bell. There you go. Is a planning director at Applied Wayfinding. Adrian is a chartered transportation planner with over 30 years of experience in the public and private sectors. He has practiced in the UK and North America and specializes in active transportation, behavior change, and urban wayfinding. I'll make sure and catch up. All right. The next speaker is Aditi Kambuj. I hope I say thanks, Aditi. She's part of Seattle Department of Transportation's Urban Design Program, which supports their departmental mission and vision to create high-quality streets and vibrant public spaces. Her work focuses on optimizing the human experience in the public realm, and that's by designing high-quality streets for people of all ages and abilities. And their goal is to promote greater use of our streets by all. Candace is a project management professional with over 10 years experience managing design and wayfinding projects. In her current role at Sound Transit, she manages and coordinates the development and implementation of the agency's signage and wayfinding program, and focusing on supporting the agency's capital expansion projects.
Hi, I'm David, and I work for the Lighthouse for the Blind, as was mentioned earlier. The Lighthouse is an employer and is largely a manufacturer. We manufacture and produce parts for commercial aircraft. We have very large machines and a large number of employees. We maintain at least 50% of our employees are either blind or deafblind. And I've been working there for 30 years, providing training to deafblind individuals to maintain access to transit, to be able to get to work and other places. I want to acknowledge the commission for the work it does on universal design, because it's a very important aspect of what I do. I would say it's a foundation for orientation and mobility. Without streets and intersections and sidewalks and traffic controls and pedestrian access at intersections, things would be very difficult. Orientation, mobility, and cane instruction is overlaid on that system and that network. And one of the key benefits of universal design is its attempt at providing some degree of predictability, which of course makes it much easier to learn and navigate. I also want to appreciate the topic for today. I think wayfinding is an inherently human activity. It's what we do to make connections with other people. And wayfinding systems, I think, generally are intended to kind of identify gaps and provide the information that we need to find our way. So, when we get up in the morning, we decide to go to work, you have to find the door, you have to make your way to the bus stop or the train station to get to work, or let's say to get to some appointment or social event. So it's a very important aspect of daily living. So also, as a trainer of deafblind individuals, I consider myself kind of a wayfinding specialist, a wayfinder. a personal trainer for deafblind people. And part of that role is identifying routes that will work for them, and then also trying to expose or eliminate gaps so that things go well. The point being an experience that would be both safe and efficient, and predictability is an important part of efficiency. So this is something I've been doing for 30 years. One of the benefits of being a person involved in training individuals is as systems are evolving or wayfinding materials are being applied, the process of working with someone and training an individual gives them exposure to those systems or those materials. They may be visual or tactile. And that exposure allows them an opportunity to provide feedback when things are, let's say, maybe not as good as they could be, or if they're actually working well. And it also provides an opportunity to sort of vet the materials, because many accessibility features to our environment really have gone through sort of a transition of improvement based on probably consumer feedback and just the logistical problems of travel. So one of the things I want to mention too at the beginning is the importance of operational solutions. King County Metro has had a policy, an accessibility policy that specifically addresses and speaks to the communication issues of deafblind individuals. And the training of their drivers is done in such a way that it makes travel by transit a much safer option and a much more reliable option. So a person waiting at the curb can feel fairly confident that they'll end up on the right bus, and they'll also get off at the right place because of the policy that's been in place for all these years. And without that, I wouldn't be able to do my job. It's a very important factor, I would call it, in our wayfinding scheme and the accessibility scheme. When I first started here, the only option we had in terms of transit were buses. Since that time, we've added many other elements of transportation, and the transportation system has gotten much more and more complicated. And as a part of that, we've had to reconsider and look at how to make those systems work for everybody. In addition to the bus system, we have, of course, light rail. We now have a streetcar. And we also have a system of cycle tracks that has sort of reconfigured the positioning of bus stops, putting them on bus islands, streetcars being separated from the sidewalk by a bicycle lane. And all of those things create additional risks and concerns, and then also a need for new ideas or new applications for maybe standard wayfinding or accessibility materials. One of the biggest challenges for a deafblind person has always been managing traffic. And in the old days, in the 90s, the solution for that was if a person was downtown or in an area, an arterial possibly, and needed to cross a busy street, they would be required to hold a card called a street crossing card over their shoulder and wait for somebody to come along and guide them across the street. And I have a very fond memory of an experience where I was training somebody in North Seattle. The individual was trying to make his way to the DVR office, and we were working on his bus route, and he got off at the right location and proceeded to stand at 135th and 25th for 5 minutes waiting for somebody to come up and guide him across the street. The office that he was trying to get to is separated only by that one crossing. What happened was, with the light on green, a King County Metro bus driver pulled up to the stop, put on his brake, got out of the bus, walked up to this gentleman who he probably had had experience with before and guided him across the street. So that was the way that people managed to get across busy traffic light intersections or make transfers. They had to do it that way. And downtown, much easier scenario. There are lots of people. A person might wait 1 to 2 minutes, not very long, to get a ride. And later, we had a government specialist named Mark Landerneau, and he was a deafblind person, and he likes to travel, and he went to Australia. And in Australia, he was shocked to find push buttons that vibrate. And he came back to Seattle and he said, I saw this amazing thing in Australia. We have to have these here. And so we contacted the Department of Transportation, and Marilyn Vanzel, who was in charge of their ADA program, agreed to install the first vibrating accessible pedestrian signal close to the lighthouse at Rainier and 23rd. And then over a period of 10 years, there was a series of other traffic engineers who was handling the ADA requests. And slowly but surely, Seattle had more and more of these devices installed at targeted locations and locations per request by individuals. And then in the 1990s, we had the light rail proposal that passed finally, and Sound Transit welcomed deafblind and blind individuals to the table to talk about access. And one of the big takeaways that happened as a result of that is the Martin Luther King corridor was installed completely intersection to intersection, corner to corner with APS, or accessible pedestrian signals. And the light rail stations there, just as an example, the Columbia City station, it was a very complex design that they had to figure out. And the result was that crossing from corner to corner or to access the station, they had to install 6 of these devices, 6 accessible pedestrian signals, and truncated dome tiles to sort of break down the space so the person could actually understand it and then access those stations. Since then, APS has become a standard, and they're being installed all over Seattle, along arterials. The 23rd Avenue Improvement Project is an example of that. They're installing them all along the waterfront. So APS is becoming a standard, and deafblind people are getting to the point where they can almost expect to have that available. Having an APS in place is the difference it makes for them to have a complete trip, or to travel efficiently, or travel independently on their own. Sound Transit also began to develop tactile wayfinding for their stations, because their stations were extremely complicated, and they settled on the tactile braid. Now, the tactile braid, once it was installed and training occurred, we realized that the detectability of it was really not sufficient. And so Sound Transit came back and called people together and reconsidered that material, and now they'll be installing a 3-bar granite paver for future stations, and we expect that to work very well. So the process of consumer feedback seems to be working, and maybe we'll be able to develop standards. There are no standards for tactile wayfinding in the United States. So this is all kind of very ahead of the trends. The Washington State ferry system is also employing this kind of material. In fact, they've installed it for their walk-on ferry already, and I've explored it and could verify that this material is actually going to work. So it's a very exciting development. There have been all kinds of other things that have made travel easier that I would consider wayfinding. Certainly, the improvements in curb ramp and truncated dome materials added to wheelchair ramps have made them more detectable, and then those have been set up with APS, including alignment curbing which gives a person 3 points of contact to get themselves into position so they're facing in the right direction when the corner is designed correctly. People are still making mistakes in that design. All the people doing the design work don't quite understand how this works, but there are plenty of examples of it, and it's an innovation, and it's very much an improvement over the past. Other things that people have come to appreciate certainly include low-floor buses, bus automated stop announcements, dynamic signage, which is much easier to see than static signage, the installation of curbside dynamic signage or kiosks that announce the next stop for buses, transit apps and apps like One Bus Away, which give people the information they need to sort of refine and become more efficient and more safe on the street because they don't have to spend as much time standing, waiting. And a deafblind person might feel a little vulnerable, especially at night. So the longer you stand, the more risk there is. Also, SMS testing in smartphones has been a huge innovation for deafblind folks. It's given them a safety cord, an ability to contact friends. We have been loading an app called Find Friends on people's phones so that I can actually identify where they are anytime during the day. So if they find themselves getting lost, I can find them. They may not know where they are located because they can't visually apprehend their position in space. And so they're able to contact me by text. I'm able to find them because of the app that they have on their phone, and I can call the police department who will go and scoop them up and bring them home. So having that kind of technology available is something that gives people much more comfort when they're out on their own. Let's see. Oh, and the development of refreshable braille displays that allow a person to have access to iPhone information and text in braille, and also carry GPS on their phones and maybe track their location independently while riding the bus, which makes them more autonomous and able to be self-sufficient. So all of these things are examples of wayfinding. They're all examples of things that have been developed that are becoming very useful and are good examples of the gaps that are being closed by either thoughtful development or technology.
Okay, I wanted to say that yes, I moved here in 2015. I used to live in Yakima, Washington. And there's a big difference between Yakima and Seattle. But here, the access is incredible. It's very good, even though there's room for improvement. David was good trainer. He was able to train me to be able to navigate my way around the Seattle area. And one of the challenges that I had was how to solve, there's a list of things, but I will talk about a couple. First, I would like to share an anecdote with you, a story. Recently, I was traveling from Soto area on the light rail and trying to meet a friend at the Starbucks headquarters down there in the Soto area. So I was using the transit app, and I was able to get off the bus appropriately at the right spot, and it said, now you need to turn right. So when I turned right, I was met with construction. And the sidewalk was closed. What was I to do now? What I did after my initial panic was to transfer over to Google Maps, and Google Maps was able to reroute me into a way that I could go. There was a name, I don't know, Lander and something, but I don't know the name of that street area, but there was a sidewalk that was on the south side, but there was none on the north side of that street. And I was like, luckily, I saw a crosswalk and I was able to navigate my way around there. There are challenges out there, and we have to figure out how to get ourselves through them creatively. Let me think of another. With the bus and the light rail, I've had a couple of things happen, both within a week. Last week, up on the bus, there's that reader that you're able to see when the next stop is and what it is. But it kept repeatedly just saying the same thing, MID1 or something. And I was frantically on my app trying to figure out, where am I? Where do I get off? Because it was not announcing the next stop. That was a huge challenge for me. And I was, without my device, my handheld device, I would have been totally lost. On the light rail, they've got information, a reader that's pretty good as well, but it doesn't always work. I was getting on at Mount Baker, and I was headed off to the University of Washington area. And the reader said, Tukwila. And it's like, what? Tukwila is way back there. Why is it still saying Tukwila? And again, I had to carefully use my eyesight to try to figure out where I was and count the stops in order for me to get off at the right spot. It's an interesting challenge, but at the same time, I wish there was another way to solve some of those issues that we encounter. Maybe there's a different app that we could possibly use that let me know where I am in live time. So I get a live feed of where I am in any moment within my travel. I don't know, am I using up all the time? Is there more time?
A few more minutes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Let's see, I'm going to refer to my notes here. Oh, I do recall on Facebook, there's a group on Facebook for deafblind people, and sometimes there's a discussion about different issues about wayfinding. That's where I learned about Google Maps, because I can be frustrated with the technology. Maybe I'm not able to see, like on a bright day, I can't read my phone. And so then I need other options. And I'm learning Braille, but that is a transition and it will take time. And David said, yeah, I know, but you can keep going. Oh, David had mentioned about the bike paths. I recall I used to work on Capitol Hill at the Deafblind Service Center, and sometimes I would make my way down to Broadway. And what I was frustrated is I would get off on the bus and I'd get confused because I didn't know where to cross on the sidewalk because of the bike paths and the bike lane. I didn't like that. So I chose not to use the buses often on Broadway because the streetcars, because they weren't accessible on streetcars. If I'm on a streetcar, I don't know where's the door going to open. I didn't know I had to push a button to have the door open. It's like, oh. I've got a lot more other antidotes. And David says, perhaps training on a streetcar would be helpful. Yes, training does definitely help. For example, today, I live in North Seattle now, on North 104th Street. But there's no sidewalks on my block. And there's no street lights. And it's like, all right, I can do this. I can trust my cane and navigate my way to where I need to go, thanks to David, who's helped train me and have made a safe route for me where I can catch a street light or two as I go onto a quiet street. But it has made me nervous. But the sidewalks, no matter what, are critical elements to have available to us. I think that's it for now.
Thank you. This is Adrian. from Applied Wayfinding. So I don't know how many of you actually realise there are people who professionally do wayfinding for a living, but there are a handful of firms who do it. And as you heard from my introduction, my background actually is a transportation planner, but the company I work for is a design company, essentially. And a lot of the issues around access and the use of information drives how we think about design. So what I wanted to talk to you a little bit today was a little bit about the background of wayfinding design, what it is, how we approach it, and how really the sort of the wayfinding industry, if you like, is thinking about universal design, and then some thoughts about where we can improve and where opportunities lie, and some of the challenges we face in finding real-world solutions. So I've got a few slides. I will describe them for anybody who can't see them, and I think there's alternate text on the versions that have been circulated as well. So just to mention the company I work for, Applied Wayfinding, have been really around since about 2007, and the company was responsible for a project called Legible London. I actually worked at Transport for London as the client for that project at the time. And that project set a new standard really in a way that it was focused specifically on providing information for the walking environment. And that's quite different to how wayfinding had been considered in the past. Most wayfinding that we commonly encountered was either in buildings or for vehicular traffic. So a lot of, obviously we need guide signs for vehicles to move, but at the time, people who were walking or using city streets were kind of disregarded. So we created this system in London to make walking a more important mode within the city, a more included part of the transportation system. And it also led us to consider early on the needs of the many tourists in London who don't speak English, the many people who have various cognitive, physical, sensory needs, and how we could start to include more people in what is essentially a very visual system. So that started us on that pathway, and we worked very closely with Mayor's Committee on Accessibility to help develop some of those ideas, and I'll talk about a few of those as we go through. First of all, I think, as David said, wayfinding is a sort of curiously human function. In fact, apparently we're the only mammals with a sense of direction, although how they found that out, I don't know. But it's something that we do by recognizing patterns, by understanding the physical environment around us and the way that we interpret that environment through whatever capabilities and culture and everything else that we have. So it's very important for us, particularly in our growing complex cities, to not only just to get from A to B, but to get something from that journey. And wayfinding plays a role in our understanding as well as our efficient movement through a city or a transit system or a complicated building. The slide here recognizes that all of us have individual requirements. We all have our individual journeys, which are all unique, and sometimes wayfinding is something we don't even think about when we're going to that usual journey to work or to our local store. It's probably something that you don't even think about until that journey goes wrong for some reason. But if you're in a new place, then it's very much at the front of mind, and it can be the only thing you think about if you feel that you are lost or just not comfortable where you are. So we have to recognize that there isn't one solution that fits all circumstances. But importantly, with universal design, as was considered in the introduction there, the idea is that we're trying to develop information that suits as many people as possible without the need for them to adapt specially. What we don't want to do is the situation we had when wheelchair access began to be something that was much more prevalent, where there was a ramp put at the back of the store. We want to put the access at level at the front, if you like, in terms of design. It's about providing information that everyone can use without special tools. A little bit about how we approach wayfinding. Really, there are three key components to a wayfinding project, and Aditi will talk a little bit more about the project in Seattle, but any large-scale project, we have to think about the audience. So the people who are using that system, that sort of information, and obviously that's very much the focus of today's talk, but also the place in which they are trying to navigate. A city is a great, huge mixture of destinations, of different districts and places and street environments and buildings. And trying to coordinate that into a system of information is a very complex task, because you need to find a way, a language for that is easily understood or easily represents that entire mix of the city, but has to be an edited version of reality. It can't show you everything. It can't be a photograph, because you can't design information in that way. And the other important point, and an important factor in how these projects come about, is to understand how particularly public sector and municipal projects come about. And I think all through the accessibility discussion, there is always this dreaded talk about what's practical or what's practicable or what's affordable. And those realistic issues are very much at the forefront, obviously, of everything we would like to do, but they are real things that we have to consider when we are thinking about a design solution. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about people and places. I think it's important to recognize that how we find our way through an environment is both how we perceive that environment, but also how that environment speaks to us, if you like. So our perception of an environment is not simply what sort of sense we use to detect that environment, but it's also how we have been brought up, where we lived, what state of mind we are in that day, whether we are in a rush, whether we have a specific journey to make in a particular time. All those things influence the sort of information we need. And that's added to by what the physical environment tells us. So in the example earlier, if there is no sidewalk, that tells you a lot about whether you're welcome in the environment in the first place, but also what your options are. If there are steps on your route, you may need to know that. You may need to know there's a rest point. So all of these factors come together, and that makes the initial part of our work very much about trying to understand as much as possible about how the place interacts with the users of that place. So we use, and there's a diagram here, we use various tools to help our clients, the people we work with, to think very broadly about users, not just down one route. Often we approach a project and we say, who is the project for? And the response is, maybe it's for tourists, but that's a very homogeneous idea of a group of people. So we have to spend some time exploring what that audience is. We also have to consider, and it's also been raised earlier, that we are in a time where the opportunities for us to provide information are changing radically. We're in an unprecedented period of technological change, which is giving us both access to unbelievable amounts of information, but the tools with which to access that information, and very few standards. So we're in a situation where it's actually quite difficult to recommend a technological solution, because by the time we've recommended it, it's out of date. So we're in a very exciting time, but also quite a challenging time. And also remembering that technology is not suitable for everybody, and it's something that changes by its very nature. So some traditional techniques, quality signs, clear maps, they will always have a place, I think, in our view, or certainly a place for a very long time. And getting a balance between the expectation that everything has to be online or on an app and other forms of information is a very important discussion to have. We're often told, can't Google do all of that? And no, it can't. Not yet. In terms of places, I think what's driving some of this industry, if you like, and some of these requirements is the fact that we have crossed the threshold now where more people live in cities than they live in rural communities. So our cities are becoming more and more busy and more dense, which makes them more complicated, and also nearly all cities are trying to encourage people to travel in more varied ways. So that means that the demands on us to travel around cities are more complicated because we can't simply get in our cars. We also recognise that overall our populations are ageing, and that's great because healthcare is allowing us to age, but it introduces chronic problems over time just as a symptom of ageing, and that's a consideration. So one of the tools we use when we're thinking about these projects is a diversity cube. So these include, I'll just slip to the next slide, these include a number of faces which are not simply about physical accessibility, for instance. They consider people's functional capacity, their social economic position, the motives for the journey, and this is very much a tool when we're talking early on to a project to spin this Rubik's Cube up and come up with a sort of notional person with a lot of different facets to their character that helps us to broaden out our approach to design. We also do just a lot of listening. We nearly always try to involve an accessibility advisory committee, if there is one for a city project, simply so we can hear about the experience of those people in that city or in that transit environment, because we never know it as well as those people. And they're often very much more practical about the real solutions that would help them. One of those solutions is an example here of a bus stop that we designed for Toronto. And the issue there was not so much the fact that we had to design Braille and tactile information in French and English, which is not a small challenge, but that most people using a cane felt that they couldn't tell one street pole from another. So the first problem was, am I standing at a bus stop, let alone what information is on it? So we designed a foot for the bus stop that actually produced a different sound when you tapped it with a cane, simply so you could distinguish one from the other. So from an information design point of view, this is an addition that is outside of the scope, if you like, of wayfinding, but critical for somebody to be able to use that information in the first place. We also learned a lot about the height of tactile and braille information, because Toronto gets pretty cold, and so you want to take your gloves off for the minimum time possible, and if that information is not at the right height and you're bending your fingers back, it makes the condition even worse. I think another important point is about box ticking, and I'm sure we've all encountered this, and sometimes we call it blue washing, but there's an example here of a station, this is Union Station in Toronto, where all of the information about how to get to a platform is simply repeated and coloured blue because it's level. And we felt that, that seems to be a bit of a box-ticking exercise. It really doesn't provide a great deal of quality information, and it actually overloads information. So we're very careful to say, and we're trying to introduce the idea, and possibly something for discussion here, about trying to introduce the idea that things should be accessible for everybody and step-free, and that we mark where there are special facilities only, rather than blanketing everything with the international symbol of accessibility. We also pay quite a lot of attention to how we can communicate information clearly for people. So this is a map we designed for Central Park that shows gradients and rest points, so that people can make their own interpretation about access through the park. We're not pretending it's perfect and suitable for everyone, but it helps everyone to understand on a hot day, perhaps in Central Park, how far and how much energy they might need to use for themselves to get around. Things like this are a move in the right direction, I think we would say. And finally, I think, going back to the point about technology, there's some interesting developments. Wayfinder is a UK-based company that's just launched an open standard for audible wayfinding. Now, we find often that we are very happy to work with the idea of apps and other personal devices, but without a standard, it's very difficult to make good recommendations. So Wayfinder might be a start of something where everyone can coalesce around one standard, accepting that not one app works for everybody, but at least in the industry, we can start to make some solid recommendations on things that will last. And that's it. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Aditi Kambuch, and I'm an urban designer with the Seattle Department of Transportation. I'm here to sort of speak a little bit more in detail of our current project in Seattle, fondly being called Seamless Seattle. It's sort of the city's new, it's the first step to really establishing a standard for pedestrian wayfinding for the city. And it's sort of, it sort of leverages a lot of coordination with our transit partners. I have a picture up on the first slide that just sort of summarizes the state of the existing wayfinding in Seattle. It's at the Weller Street Bridge, where it touches down on the west side. And there are 3 signs from 2 different agencies there pointing to various destinations. But one thing that's missing is, for example, the sounder. It's right around the corner. It makes some certain assumptions about what people would know or how to get to the sounder. And it sort of defines our issue a little bit in Seattle, where we have multiple agencies working in limited right-of-way, trying to provide a service, and we're trying to address this problem and try to get more streamlined and user-oriented. Just really quickly, we start with our slide decks with SDOT's vision, mission, and core values, which is really to create a thriving, equitable community powered by dependable transportation. We're committed to 6 core values of equity, safety, mobility, sustainability, livability, and excellence. And our mission is to deliver a transportation system that provides safe and affordable access to places and opportunities. I have a lot of information to cover because it's a project and it's in our community and it will affect all of us, but I'm going to try and keep it brief and to the time. But I'll talk about why wayfinding, what our process was to develop this project, our strategy that we came up with, talk a little bit more specifically about Design for All, our approach to Design for All, and then the pilot projects that we plan to build over the next couple of years. So why wayfinding? One, as our city grows and becomes more dense, with more people living and moving about, we have our policy goals to encourage more active transportation, get people walking and support walking journeys, as well as transit use and biking. So we want to provide a level of information that people can predictably rely on. We've had that kind of information for vehicles for a long time. Regardless of which city you're in, you probably can figure out how to navigate in it. And that kind of standard doesn't exist for pedestrian wayfinding. We want to create a more equitable and accessible public realm. We know that the existing state of wayfinding is not working, both signage, but then also there's a host of other issues, such as curb ramps and APS, and David and Deborah spoke about a lot of that. We also know it's a city that's changing rapidly, and it's sort of, the time is right now to establish a common standard, because if we don't, every project is likely to do its own thing, and it sort of exacerbates the current condition of not having one single system of dependable information. So the waterfront project's happening, SD Sound Transit is expanding, there's a lot of private development in the city, so we wanted to sort of create that common standard. And it's an opportunity to test how our agencies can work better together to create a more user-oriented system. So the first thing we did as we started this project was to bring together a diverse set of stakeholders to define sort of the North Star for what we're trying to achieve, the vision for the project. And what we came up with is the sentence, I am provided with the information I need when I need it to inspire me to explore Seattle and to help me choose the best way to travel in the city. It sort of is based in the user's voice and perspective, so that's one major sort of fundamental shift that we're trying to do, is really think about what works for the end user and less for agency sort of convenience. It also recognizes that every trip is different and every user is different with unique needs, and we're going to try to meet the broadest range of needs possible through this work. So a little bit about our process, and the first slide here is really talking about how do people wayfind, and Adrian spoke a lot about that. Applied Wayfinding was our main consultant to help us with this work, so the first step was to hire the right team of people who can help us. That included Applied, a local consultant team called Alta, Peggy Martinez, who was until very recently a local consultant, as well as David Burtis, who is a UK-based accessibility consultant. I have 2 maps up on this slide. They're hand-drawn sketches that came out in a workshop we did with some end users, and it's sort of how gave us a clue as to how people wayfind in Seattle specifically. What are the points of reference people use? And that was part of the process. The next step was really taking a little deeper dive into understanding Seattle and our unique sort of opportunities and challenges. The image here is a cross-section of a sloping street, and it sort of represents the waterfront of Seattle here to our west, going up to First Avenue and Second Avenue. And it sort of is a really unique challenge here where if you were unfamiliar with Seattle's topography and you were looking at Google Maps, the distance between First Avenue and the waterfront is a couple of blocks, and you would think you could navigate that in a few minutes. It's actually a massive grade change, and often if you were with a stroller or in a wheelchair, would have a hard time navigating that, especially because a lot of the elevators and through building access points are not very well marked. The other sort of just a quick summary of challenges and opportunities is that a street topology is getting more complex. David sort of mentioned that. We're trying to get people biking more safely and walking more safely, and there is, in the absence of a standard that's already established for how to do that well, we're kind of inventing it as we go along and trying to get better at it. A street grid is kind of challenging. It's parallel to the water in some points. It's perpendicular at others, which leads to some interesting challenges with both street naming as well as just the physical experience of navigating the street grid can be quite complex. Even for folks who are very familiar with the neighborhood, you can get turned around. And then we also looked at how people sort of think about their neighborhoods and think about places. And neighborhoods really emerged as the key sort of connection that people have to their physical environments. And the name there was really important, and that sort of carried through in our design. Also wanted to acknowledge that wayfinding information and signs is sort of one part of a solution. There are several other projects like the curb ramp improvements and accessible pedestrian signals that have a huge role to play. Maps can only go so far. So in parallel, we're working on several other things, including a bench pilot later this year and sort of an age-friendly design toolkit for streets. Part of the process also dealt with engaging with the end user pretty significantly. We did everything from focus groups to more specific working groups of sort of subject matter experts, to briefings and workshops with commissions and boards. And we were able to really sort of unearth a rich amount of information to inform this project. So it's robust, and it's something that we plan to continue as the pilot gets rolled out, doing some testing. Our strategy sort of focused on 4 pillars, the 4 being modal integration, so really thinking about how a common standard can be deployed at both light rail stations, bus stops, and in the street right-of-way. How local distinctiveness between neighborhoods can play a role while maintaining sort of system-wide legibility. Design for all, so developing a system that would be most usable for the broadest spectrum of users and abilities. And then systemization is something that we've traditionally sort of been a little bit weaker on, is that creating the rules at the back of house to make sure it's a sustainable system going forward. So it's not sort of ad hoc and invented as the project expands. Adrian talked about the design for all approach a little bit, so I'm not going to go too much into the sort of diversity cube approach, but really the key takeaways for me were that every journey is unique, that the journey starts at the trip planning stage, as JC mentioned in the introduction. It's when you start thinking about where you want to go, and that's when you're starting to think about how and when, and wayfinding starts at that point. That legibility is a personal issue. You could be a commuter one day in a neighborhood that you're very familiar with, but a completely new area might throw you off, and you're a different type of user. Or if you're traveling with your child, you're a different kind of user than when you're traveling to work by yourself. So there are different needs depending on your personal situation. And then, of course, the principles of universal design were carried through as we went through the design. We also looked at a bunch of best practices, especially for design for all. The US Access Board has a lot of guidance for how to do accessible infrastructure planning. We have local standards from Seamless Seattle, which is a right-of-way improvement manual. UW is doing some interesting work with their access map. And that was great, but what we found missing was the sort of common standard for accessible wayfinding. And that's, so we're hoping that this project really becomes the start of that discussion. We also looked at other local design for all best practices, including how can we, I know Peggy Martinez has been doing some work about how do we integrate sort of information about our more complex streets in tactile and braille information at street intersections. So that's something that we're intrigued by and want to test some of that in our pilot phase, as well as local initiatives at the Seattle Pacific University and the UW Access Map. More internationally, the city of Sydney is an interesting example where they have both braille and tactile information at 3,000 controlled intersections in the city. And that really sort of provides the orientation information for all users. So it's not just about destination finding, but also confirming where you are in your journey as you go along. So this information is at all of their APS locations, for example. And that's something we would want to test here in our pilot. The challenge for us being that our poles are not in predictable places. And so we're going to test it out at a location and then see how it can be actually scaled. And Adrian sort of had the New York City Central Park map up, which had a lot of information about accessible pathways and ramps, and that provided a little bit of sort of inspiration for how we could describe slopes in Seattle on our map. So then, more specifically, our actual project that we're doing in 2020, 2021, we're looking at about 4 pilot areas. The first phase being sort of the Westlake Hub area, so sort of the 5-minute walk shed around the Westlake Link station, as well as the 5-minute walk shed around the Chinatown ID Link station. Both of these destinations sort of gateways to a city with a lot of people arriving here and sort of dispersing. There's also a lot of signage and clutter in these areas already, so part of our project is decluttering and removing information that is no longer relevant or essential from a regulatory perspective for safety. And in Chinatown ID, of course, we have a sort of multiple languages being spoken, so that it's a great opportunity to test how our system would adapt to that, as well as a higher than average proportion of older adults living there. So the sign family that we have for the pilot phase is about 6 elements. From left to right on the slide, we have the image for it is the area sign. Something called an overview map, which provides sort of the 20-minute walk shed. The nudge or finger post signs, which there are currently those red finger posts out there, which we would be replacing. A much more slender, small sign, which we would place outside buildings that have public access through them as a public benefit for zoning, additional land use density. Those routes are often hidden, and unless you're a Seattle resident and know where they are, you may not know that you could go between 3rd and 4th Avenue using an elevator or an escalator, but we want to provide that information in the right-of-way, as well as information at transit stops, and then some pavement markers to mark out sort of accessible routes. The sign family design features look at several different elements and how essential elements to make the information legible, including viewing heights, testing for color blindness, making sure the information is simple enough to understand, integrating second language when necessary, and then the tactile and braille information. Each of the signs that we have include braille and tactile information at a predictable location, as well as at 4th and Pine, we'll test out placing that information on street poles at that intersection to provide orientation information to help people confirm where they are in their journey. And then really quickly, map features include showing through building routes, as well as indicating whether they have elevator or escalator access. hill slopes if they're greater than 5%, as well as directionality. The map is heads up and turned around to the direction in which you're facing the map, so you don't have to sort of navigate north up and make it relate to the map, including illustrated landmarks as well as universal iconography, adding in information about restrooms and public health facilities, accessible transit entrances, as well as park amenities such as benches, so publicly provided seating facilities. Some of the, in parallel, we have digital recommendations, and this really came up in our cross-disability workshop that we hosted, that having a robust set of digital tools is going to be critically important so that information is more widely usable. So we're looking at creating an open wayfinding platform that could serve as a central repository for wayfinding information in Seattle, as well as a digital map that would churn out information about things like sidewalk closures, to address Deborah's issue and point about both missing sidewalks as well as sidewalk closures being available to people real time. And then post-pilot, we also want to discuss and assess as part of our evaluation the need for making the on-street signage more discoverable. So should we have a standard for tactile treatment to help discover these signs in the right-of-way, as well as integrating sort of QR coding and information, or another way of connecting the physical on-street signage to a digital platform. So there is that sort of link between the two going forward. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you for having me today. Again, my name is Candace Toth. I'm the program manager for capital signage at Sound Transit. And I want to share an overview of the different wayfinding tools that Sound Transit has designed into our facilities to assist riders of all abilities in navigating our transit system. So I'll start with a brief background on who Sound Transit is and what we do. Then I'll discuss physical and tactile tools in our system, followed by audiovisual tools, and then end with some of our innovation projects. So Sound Transit is a public transit agency serving the central Puget Sound region that covers about a region of 3.8 million people. That's about 40% of Washington's state population. Our district covers 3 counties and 52 cities, and we're governed by an 18-member board of elected local officials. We're also building the largest rail expansion project in the county over the next 20 years. And that covers multiple modes that we build, operate, and run. So those modes include Link Light Rail, which currently runs from Angle Lake south of SeaTac to University of Washington by Husky Stadium. We're expanding that light rail system to 118 miles and 65 stations with this project, and connecting the cities of Seattle, Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland, Issaquah, Tacoma, Everett, and the neighborhoods of Ballard and West Seattle. We also have Tacoma Link Light Rail that runs in downtown Tacoma. We're going to be adding 12 stations to that system to connect the Hilltop neighborhood and Tacoma Community College. We operate Sounder commuter trains over 89 miles of track that connect Everett, Seattle, and Lakewood, and we'll be adding service improvements to that system. We operate ST Express bus routes, and we'll be opening a new mode, bus rapid transit, serving 12 cities in the next couple years. So we're busy. So as we design and build our stations and our vehicles, we use a number of tools to ensure that our modes are accessible to all. A really important wayfinding tool that we build into our system and our stations are tactile pavers, which has been mentioned a few times by people up here. Tactile pavers are a system of textured ground tiles that provide detectable cues through stations and platforms. And they're really meant to assist riders who are visually impaired, but they do benefit everyone. They're meant to be easily detectable visibly as well as by foot or by cane. There are 3 types of tactile pavers within our transit system that help folks navigate our different modes. The first are domed pavers, which indicate stop on all of our platforms. Then we have 2 other tactile pavers within our Link Light Rail system. We have what we call corduroy pavers, which indicate waiting zones and create waiting pads, if you will. and then linear pavers, which provide a tactile pathway through our stations. The domed pavers are used for what is called the detectable warning strip, or DWS for short, because that's a long word, which is located at the edge of all of our platforms, and again, indicates where to stop. It's a 2-foot wide strip of domed yellow tiles that provide a safe buffer zone between traffic and pedestrians. And here it's shown at a Sounder platform, but we use it on all of our platforms: Sounder Commuter Rail, Link, Tacoma Link, and future bus rapid transit. This detectable or warning strip is required by ADA. On Sounder, the trains are not level with the platform, so they do require riders to take a few steps up in order to board a car. So as a result, on platforms, the detectable strip and a high platform ramp are provided for riders with mobility challenges to board trains safely. And those high platform ramps are basically an elevated section of the platform with a ramp that goes to it. There's one per Sounder platform. On Link Light Rail, trains are level with the platform, provide what we call level boarding. And so a different system has evolved there. We've added between car barriers onto the detectable strip on Link to assist with locating train doors. These are required by the FTA, a new requirement within the last couple years. And they're sets of 3-foot high yellow flexible bollards that are located along the platform edge. And they ensure riders who are visually impaired do not mistake gaps between trains for train doors. Additionally, at Link, we have a few other elements. Link stations are typically multi-level and much more complex environments. And so we have 2 other additional types of tactile pavers. We have linear pavers that provide a tactile pathway from the station entries all the way to the station platforms. These are made of granite, and as David mentioned, they have a braid pattern on them, which was originally designed by an artist in collaboration with members of the community and the Citizens Accessibility Advisory Group, which still exists today and is a great resource for our agency. It's a sound transit committee that's open to the public. And these linear pavers start at the station entries, proceed through the station, branching to things like ticketing machines, and then also to the different choices people have in vertical circulation, so stairs, escalators, and elevators, and then continue to the platform. The linear paver tactile pathway is combined with corduroy pavers in these stations, which indicate waiting zones. So these waiting zones are located in front of elevators and on our platforms. The corduroy paver waiting areas on the platforms align with the 2 centermost Link Light Rail train doors, and they also are synced up with our tactile signage on the platform level. These tiles are dark gray tiles that have a really tight striped horizontal ridge pattern to them, kind of like corduroy fabric. So combined in our system, these tactile pavers go above and beyond ADA requirements for Link. And as David mentioned, there's not strict criteria for tactile wayfinding in the US. So it's definitely something that we believe in, but we continue to iterate to try to improve. And on that note, changes are coming to the tactile path very soon. Again, that's been mentioned. In 2018, we decided to change the texture of the linear pavers based on rider feedback. So the braid texture is going to change to 3 linear ridges to make it easier to detect in our stations. And that's going to start with our Northgate stations opening in 2021 and for all the new stations after that. We also realized that our guidance criteria wasn't clear enough to ensure that all of our design teams were laying that path out in a very consistent way. For instance, making sure that path always goes to a ticketing machine, not just a ticketing wall. So we've been revising our criteria to give better guidance as well. So like the linear pavers, our tactile signage has also changed over time based on ADA and feedback from our riders. And it does go above and beyond ADA requirements. So for those who aren't familiar, tactile signage is signage that has raised letters and braille. Previously, our tactile signage was made out of acrylic, and we faced pretty consistent vandalism with people picking the braille bumps off of it. And then also we kind of went overboard and put tactile signage all throughout the entire station, and we were told by our writers that it was really hard to find. So as a result, we updated our tactile signage in 2016. We switched material from acrylic to zinc, haven't had vandalism issues. And then we also revised the strategy for where we located it and consolidated the tactile information onto key decision points along that tactile pathway through our station. So we provide the station name, the mode, the direction of travel that's required by ADA entries and platforms. But we also provide it at key decision points like elevators. So I have a couple examples here from Capitol Hill Station. On the left, there's an example sign from the platform where that platform is a center platform, so you need to choose to go left or right to decide which train you want to board. And the sign is perpendicular to the tracks and says Capitol Hill Station, left platform, link to University of Washington, right platform, link to Angle Lake. Then I have another example on the right of a sign at the platform level, elevator at Capitol Hill Station. So there, this sign says Capitol Hill Station, elevator up to exit, Broadway East and East John Street via mezzanine. I'm not going to go through every aspect of our static signage, and static signs are those signs that are not electronic and don't change content, but I do want to touch on a couple improvements we're trying to make in our system. Currently, we have a labeled exit signage pilot in our 4 downtown stations. That's Westlake, International District, University Street, and Pioneer Square. Not in that order, though. It launched in November. It's going to continue through 2020. And we're labeling our exits with numbers instead of providing text-heavy cross-street information, and then pairing that with directories. So this allows us to provide much larger legible text with clearer directions and addresses the issue of riders having difficulty orienting themselves in a tunnel and figuring out what exit to use. We identified best practices of a number of other systems and realized the benefits of labeled exits, particularly for non-native speakers, limited English proficiency, first-time users, riders who are high-functioning illiterate, and riders who have low vision. So overhead numbered signs are paired with wall-mounted directories containing cross streets, popular destinations, local landmarks, and are paired with photos of those landmarks and destinations. And pairing information with photos, we feel is really going to help people navigate our stations and systems. The criteria for these directories was based on the Seamless Seattle work that Aditi spoke about, and then fine-tuned for our transit stations. And we're also deploying the maps that Aditi's been working on in our downtown stations. We do have a survey for this pilot project, and we'd really like riders with disabilities to give us feedback on how this signage is working. So that link will be sent out to registered attendees after the forum. Our payment system includes audio features to make paying easier. Ticketing machines have braille, large format text, and audio features that can be accessed with headsets. You do need to buy a ticket or use an ORCA card on our train systems, and our ORCA card reader machines also have audio cues built into them to help make them easier to find in our stations and provide payment confirmation. So they beep once when you tap on to begin your ride with an ORCA card, and they beep twice when you tap off to end your ride. And that was recently reprogrammed. Our dynamic signage in stations and trains provides audiovisual announcements about upcoming stops and stations. And then the dynamic signs, to clarify, are electronic digital signs that have changeable content. They also provide our safety and emergency messaging. We are working on some improvements to our dynamic signage that will be rolled out in 2023 with Eastlink. We've updated our standards, and we're changing to full color, high resolution, flat panel signs in our stations and on new vehicles that are currently being built. So on board trains, those signs are going to have a moving line map that shows you the station you just passed, the station you're at, and the next 2 stops. And then it will also have a graphic display to indicate which side of the train doors are going to open on, paired with audio announcements. But we're trying to reduce reliance on text where possible. In stations, we're going to continue to display train arrival information, but with increased accuracy. We're building a new content management system, so think of that as the brain that manages all these signs. And that's going to provide better integration to our rider alert system and allow us to provide messages quicker across all modes and make them more site-specific. So for instance, it will give us the ability to do something like if you are in a train traveling towards Capitol Hill and the elevators are out, we could deploy a message to that vehicle that would initiate audio and scrolling messages 2 stops before Capitol Hill saying, elevators are out at Capitol Hill, and give that notice to the people on board at an appropriate time in their journey. Another active project I want to touch on is we are developing a revised line naming convention for Link. I want to mention this because the decision is going to impact a number of things, like our audio-visual announcements, our station and vehicle signs, online and mobile trip planning tools. But in 2012, our board had adopted a policy where Link lines would be named with a color and the end-of-line destination. So for instance, red line to Northgate. We waited to introduce those line names until closer to Eastlink and rolled them out this past summer, and heard pretty quickly from the community that there was concern over the name Redline because it was reminiscent of the term redlining, which was a discriminatory practice of denying home loans and mortgages to people of color and minorities. So we agreed to pause, step back, honor that request, and develop a new line naming proposal. We spent the last 4 months developing a new naming system to get it ready for Northgate opening next year. We're going to take it to the board in April. And this slide just shows where we were, not where we're going. But it kind of gives you an overview of what had been planned for line names. We were going to have a red line, which would have served Everett to West Seattle, a blue line from Mariner to Redmond, green line from Tacoma Ballard, purple line from Kirkland to Issaquah, and orange line in Tacoma. But we've decided to not only move away from colors as the primary indicator, but also drop the color red. So that has a pretty big impact to ensure that we can provide appropriate color contrast between lines in our map system. And we also realize there are a number of other colors that are problematic in this context. So we're undertaking a full system redesign that doesn't use color as the primary identifier. And so we did identify some criteria and goals with this effort that include making sure that this new naming system is friendly and intuitive, inclusive and equitable, scalable. Colors, as I mentioned, can be limited, but letters and numbers are not. Meets requirements for riders with limited English proficiency, low or no vision, and color vision deficiency. Integrates well with our transit partner service, which is also expanding. Minimizes the needs for future changes, and provides a holistic, systematic approach for all of our modes, not just Link. Let's think about Stride, which is our bus rapid transit, Sounder, and Tacoma Link. So stay tuned in April. And then lastly, I want to touch on our accessible wayfinding technology projects and innovation efforts, which are really focused on wayfinding and accessible mobility, and pairing those two things in a way to enhance access both to and through our stations. So we recently submitted an accessible mobility on demand grant, which is currently being reviewed by the Federal Transit Administration. If we get it, we really want to use that to work to integrate accessible wayfinding technology. For instance, that could be something like Bluetooth beacons with access maps and other tools. We really want to work towards mobility as a service with this effort and this work. And accessibility could be improved and delivered through a number of different ways. So the resulting technology and solutions are still to be determined, but it could have a bunch of different impacts, like could improve station navigation or our call center services, or ensuring vehicles are more accessible in certain ways, assist with finding gaps in our system, like the gap between a drop-off point and the station. So for instance, I have a little visual of a hypothetical example of a resulting technology that could happen if we get this grant. So say you're dropped off at Pioneer Square Station, which has been fitted with mobile beacons, and as you approach, you get an alert on your mobile phone that says you're about to arrive at the station drop-off location from your on-demand ride, navigating you to the closest ticket vending machine and northbound platform now. So we have a lot of things in the works that we're working on. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
You all mentioned technology a lot, and so I'm very curious to hear if you can speak a little bit more to the opportunities and challenges with integrating technology as opposed to the physical wayfinding systems that you also spoke about.
Hi, this is David. While I was sitting listening to the presentations, I was writing up my wish list, things that I would like to see happen. In terms of technology, one thing that I think that would be useful is, and this is something related to bus transit as much as it is for light rail, with the introduction of a second line in the downtown bus tunnel, deafblind individuals' ability to make an independent decision as to which train they want to get on will be eliminated. So there needs to be a solution, and it might be a technology solution, it might be a smartphone solution, where they get early arrival information, they know what the next train is, sent automatically to their smartphone so they could read that on their braille display and know that the next train is going to the east side, or the next train is going to go to the airport or Angle Lake or whatever the ultimate destination is. And similarly, in terms of bus transit, I can see smartphone technology, like, for example, currently there's an option where a person can use a text number to get real-time stop announcements. So you might be standing at a bus stop and you use this particular text number, and if you enter the stop number and send that to the number, then you immediately get the series of next bus stop, bus arrival times and the numbers. And it would be certainly a way to identify what buses habitate that particular stop, but then it would also give important information to the individual. The one thing that is difficult in that particular case is getting access to the stop number. So just as an example of an enhanced Braille program, all Metro or King County Metro coaches have a coach number in Braille and large print on all the coaches. If you could put a similar kind of labeling on all the bus stops or shelters with the stop number, the person would have access to the stop number, and then they could send out that text and get the information. If that can't be done automatically through some electronic method, then a physical Braille label on all bus stops would access a lot of information, and it would probably limit the amount of Braille that would need to be installed, because people would like to have as much information as the general public at bus stops. So that's just one technology solution, or two technology issues and possible solutions that I can think of. And there's some other things on my wish list.
Thank you, David. Anyone else?
This is Candace with Sound Transit. I think, David, you brought up some really good examples of how technology can be used to improve the transit system. I did want to mention that the issue with deafblind riders knowing which trains are arriving, particularly when Eastlink opens in 2023 and we have 2 lines serving the same platform, is a really good example of a gap we're aware of. And so we're actually partnering with the Innovation Program, which is a new program within Sound Transit this year, to solicit proposals to provide solutions to that gap. And so as far as knowing what the implementation plan is, it'll depend on the proposals, but we are working on it. I think also improved real time is a really big thing that our agency is talking about, and navigation tools within our system, and how can we help improve just literally navigating the station environment as well. I guess with that, anyone else?
So this is Aditi from the city. I think technology-wise for the city, there are obvious advantages, particularly pushing out real-time information with sidewalk closures, construction-related closures that happen, for short periods of time or extended periods of time. That's not something that we can put on physical signage, but we have to find a way to share that with our partners, whether it's Google Maps or other service providers. The challenge there for us is it's not something we do. It's not an expertise we necessarily have or the best at. So it's kind of it's a learning curve for us to push that information out in a way that apps and map sort of providers out there can absorb and integrate, including one bus away. I think the other challenge, and it's a great one, is this fact that technology is changing so rapidly. And for example, I knew Sound Transit had a grant application, but so as agencies move forward in different directions, how do we stay connected? So we're, as people are exiting stations or entering them, we're pointing them to the same things, or at least ensuring we call the same places by the same names, and not creating sort of more levels of confusion as we go forward. But those are the great opportunities to work together.
Aditi, you mentioned clutter and confusion, and so I also feel like maybe wayfinding, you could have too much of a good thing. So you can have too much. So Deborah, and then happy to hear from others, have you ever experienced that, where there was too much noise or too much wayfinding, and what might be some practices to give you just the right amount of information? You can pass.
Well, I think that the technology, as it improves and gets better, we're dependent on the technology. And that may be the best solution. For an example, in the tunnels with the light rail, we look up and you see the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but they don't mean anything to me currently. That's because I'm still dependent on the street names and not the number of a particular system. I really don't like the signs because they don't really work for us. We have to look and try to find where they're located. And I think technology would be a better option ultimately in the end.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. Anybody else? Thoughts?
This is Adrian, just talking about sort of the physical side of information in the street. I think we're very aware, in fact, one of the principles for the Seamless Seattle project was 1 in and 5 out. I think that we recognize straight away that adding more signs, however pretty they may be, was not necessarily a good decision. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, sorry. So just to say that we are very aware that too many signs is a bad thing, no matter how well they may be designed, and we're not in the business of making signs. Our job is to make places more understandable and more legible. And the first solution is always to change the physical environment so that it's easier to move around in, and then to add information if you can't physically resolve the environment. It's very difficult in most cities, and it's almost impossible in a transit system to use them without information, but our first instinct is always to say, effectively, put the door at the front of the building and not at the back. And that will make the wayfinding job a lot easier. So I think there are two sides. One is that from a design point of view, signs are not the first answer. And secondly, that our cities are already cluttered with information. So if we are going to put information in, we should do it with a view to removing redundant information first.
I think that's partly an issue of field loss and not really having signs located in a place where a person is naturally going to look when they get off the train. So currently in the downtown stations, the signage is beautiful in terms of its fonts, color, contrast, but it's mounted on the sidewall of the platform, and when a person gets off the train and heads for the escalator, they're not looking at the walls. So they miss that information in terms of the numbering of exits, and all of that information becomes intangible and hard to understand. The other thing I wanted to comment on was the clutter question, and clutter on city streets is a big issue for cane travelers, and we had lots of issues with shared bikes. This isn't really a signage issue or a wayfinding issue. Well, it's a wayfinding issue from the point of view of efficiency, being able to move from block to block without having obstacles to navigate and work around. So some thinking about the arrangement of the signage, certainly, how it's displayed, and trying to preserve the sanctity of the sidewalk so there aren't things getting in the way that would be an impediment to people. And I know the city has been contemplating activity zones and trying to make the street livelier, having multi-purpose streets where you have sidewalks and streets as a blended surface. All of that needs to be well defined so a person working their way up the sidewalk doesn't end up in the street. And then also maybe you could use textural enhancements to separate the activity zones, the outdoor cafe space from the sidewalk, so there isn't a lot of confusion as a person is trying to work their way up the street.
Yep, and this is Candace with Sound Transit. I definitely agree with all my fellow panelists up here. I think signage, it's easy to think of wayfinding as signage, but ultimately it's a lot more than that. And ideally, it's the physical environment itself being a bit more intuitive to use. So signs are not the first line of defense, but they are necessary in our environment. But wherever we can be more efficient with information and minimize it, I think is an improvement. We definitely have been mindful at the agency of when we've expanded our system and had signage updates, that's also been inclusive of signage maintenance, if you will, and trying to remove as much extra signage that kind of populates over the years and consolidate information, and that's an ongoing effort. But I think it's really important as we have new initiatives that always be part of the scope, and that was something that definitely came up in the Seamless Seattle, and Aditi ensured was in the scope, that as we launch something new, let's think about the old things out there, and if they're orphans, maybe we need to get them out of that environment. And to kind of Deborah and David's point about the numbered exits, that's a really good example of something that could be improved. So I would say ensuring signs work, part of it is legibility and clarity, but the other part is the sign in the right place for a decision. And that's something we're interested in hearing. So I would definitely ask and beg that everyone take our survey, and that's really useful feedback. If you go in those stations right now, you'll notice a lot of those signs are kind of temporary materials, because we want to have the opportunity to test those signs, get information, and improve the system before we make a permanent commitment.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Marcy Carpenter. I'm the president of the National Federation of the Blind of Washington. I concur with what Deborah was saying about the numbered signs. I've seen these big, beautiful numbers, but had no idea what they meant. Maybe you could send out in the alerts, the text alerts that come out, or the email alerts about, hey, there's this new system of finding your way out of the station, here's a link. Are there any plans for putting audible, so when the link trains open, having an audible announcement that announces this is the train to, whatever the end destination is? I know that is an issue during Connect 2020, but it's also an issue when there is a problem and the trains all board, because there's a problem on the south platform at a station. They're all boarding at the north platform or whatever, however that works. And then, I don't know if any of you know the answer to this, but do you know if there's any plan to finally make the trip planner app accessible, or is it just being abandoned?
Sure. So I'm just writing them down so I can answer things in the order you asked. So in relation to the numbered exits, I think that writer alert's a great idea. I'll take that back to our team. internally. We are planning to have audible announcements for This Is the Train 2. That is very much wrapped into that new content management system we're building for dynamic signs. Right now, our system's pretty old and has pretty limited capabilities. So this new system we're building, which will launch in 2023 with the opening of Eastlink, will provide us that ability, and we're developing those messages now for that design team and IT project. And then I'm not sure about the Trip Planner app, but I can definitely find out and we can send updates.
Great. Other questions?
Thank you. My name is Jamie. I work with SDOT in public space management. I'm wondering, this issue about all the various uses of the right-of-way, the bike lanes, the bus rapid transit, the streetcars, et cetera. It's definitely new for Seattle, and there's a lot to figure out with that for accessibility, but it's not new in other cities. So I'm wondering, in America, usually it is, I guess, but like in Northern Europe, are there good examples that are available of where accessibility is really at the forefront of the thinking and how they've designed things?
Yeah, I mean, it's been, I suppose we had a head start on you guys. We've been looking at physical accessibility in the environment since sort of the early 90s when I started. In fact, the early 80s when I started. But yeah, it's been an ongoing issue, and one of the particular issues is the ambition for what you might call open streets, so streets closed to traffic that are available for people without vehicles, with very good ambitions there, but unwittingly creating environments where people, particularly with visual impairments, feel completely unable to access that environment because they have no defining edges. And that's been an ongoing issue in those areas. A battle between the urban designers and wishing to create a beautiful environment and the need to create perhaps tactile guidelines, guidance areas, other forms of delineation, particularly where perhaps you have, say in London, where you have streets where buses are able to access pedestrian streets, which works fantastically in a model, but is more difficult for people. And in practice, they do work well because people with visual impairments and blindness don't go there. So it's not one that's resolved. It's a real battle of ideologies as much as anything. I think, unfortunately, it's been somewhat of a majority wins at the moment. Many people enjoy those environments, and many cities have, of course, not enough public space. So there's an ongoing issue. Fortunately, things like audio beacons and technology is helping to resolve some of those issues now because the physical environment cannot explain all of that. But I don't believe, from my contacts back in the UK, that there is still arguments about this. Cycling as a mode is growing in most modern cities, and that's creating its own difficulties. So it's a battle of advocacy groups and interests, which is healthy, provided there is a mechanism for that resolution. So I think, although it's not much of an answer, and I'm not a politician anymore, but I think it's it's actually having forums like this for that discussion is the only way to reach those resolutions, because they're done with the best intentions. But we only learn by actually trying to actually experience the mistakes and then address them with willingness. And at least there is a willingness to discuss those mistakes and to correct them. So I'm not sure how hopeful that is, but I think there's certainly progress being made, and there are examples to look to from Europe for sure.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth with King County Design and Civic Engagement. This is for Aditi with Seamless Seattle. How are you guys planning to implement the ever-changing urban landscape here in Seattle with the build of all of these wayfinding signs? Like, there are streets that are constantly changing, city blocks I don't even recognize anymore, and you can't just quickly, swap out signs, I wouldn't imagine.
Making sure the information that's on the maps is sort of things that are unlikely to change in sort of the 2 to 5 year time frame. It's the design of the sign. They're sort of built-in panels, and so if something needs to be replaced, it's just the map panel, not the entire sign, so we can switch it out. And then I think, again, going back to the sort of the real-time changes that are happening with closures and things, sort of having a connection between the physical sign and a digital platform that has that level of information allows for us to fill those gaps that we can't put out on a static sign in the street.
I'm actually really curious to hear a little bit about engagement. Candace, you have a survey open right now encouraging people. I also feel like wayfinding, there's a lot of, it's very tactical and it's very personalized. And so just to hear a little bit more about the engagement strategies to uncover what is the best practice. For example, I know in New York City, the subway station, they've created an accessibility lab where you can go and test out a variety of tools, and that's at a cost. But just kind of understanding a little bit more about some of the engagement strategies that worked or maybe didn't work in order to come to the right solution.
In our agency over the last few years, we've been incorporating more user-centered design into our projects and the scopes of our projects. So that is a field of testing that actually, we as subject matter experts or designers may have a solution for a problem, but that's really building in a testing phase where we actually go out and observe riders, do surveys with riders, maybe deploy pilots of something and have riders interact with those new signs, or we did this for our ticket vending machine when we had to update it, for instance. We just created some example screen flows on a iPad and went out to our stations and asked people, gave them a task and asked them to try to complete it, and then took notes on what worked and what didn't, and kind of asked them to think out loud and identified themes of kind of the pros and cons of our design and how we could update and iterate it, and then really make database decisions. So that's something we've been moving towards more. So we definitely do rely on surveys. Those can be online, like the signage pilot survey, or they could be in the station, such as the user testing. We do plan to do some user testing over the summer on that signage, so we have some staff members who have experience in that. I see one in the audience right now, so they'll be developing a test plan. We also do have a number of committees, such as the Citizens Accessibility Advisory Committee and our Sound Waves panel, and we'll use those groups as well to get feedback on various projects or do material testing or sample testing. So.
David.
Hi, I just want to mention something more about texture and using texture to help define the environment. And I see Dion Graham sitting out there in the audience. The work that Sound Transit has done with wayfinding in the stations, I think, has been very beneficial, and there are some materials that have been identified as being very effective. And I think one of the examples of that would be the corduroy tile that's used for identifying the boarding location on Link light rail. The sounder stations, on the other hand, the material used on those platforms are almost indetectable. And it would be nice to sort of upgrade that and use a material that we know works so that people can identify the door locations along the very long sounder platforms. And not only would it be useful for boarding at any location, if you're not a person in a wheelchair, you don't need to use the mini high. You can get on at any coach. That would make it easier to identify the door for the train. But it also provides a little grammar for the length of the platform, because usually those stations have an adjacent transit facility for buses. And having worked with a deafblind person at the Auburn station recently, finding the bays on the opposite side of the platform are very hard to find if you don't have some kind of grammar. So having those markers for the doors provides something to count and a way of measuring the length of the platform and to help define the location of those bays on the far side. And that also could be applied to like rapid ride and downtown bus stops, where you have that corduroy stretching across the width, sort of in a perpendicular orientation to a person's direction of travel, to identify the head of the zone for any bus stop. So then a person wouldn't have to be hunting for the kiosk or the head of the zone, walking precariously at the curb edge with buses pulling up to the stop. They would be able to walk right up the middle of the sidewalk, find that texture, make a left turn, and head right to the place where they could get picked up. So just a couple of suggestions.
But It is true, our sounder stations use a pretty different tactile system, and we do not have the corduroy pavers there. We have what we call welcome mats, which are etched granite pavers in front of each door that say welcome, and they have a geometric pattern. They were actually developed in tandem with the art program again. It is difficult when we're looking at a system that's fully built, because that means retrofit. And so with light rail and some of our other modes, we have the advantage of expansion, which provide these opportunities for update. So one thing I will say is we are thinking a lot about tactile at our bus rapid transit platforms, which will be high platforms with level boarding on the train. So we are thinking about how we can provide those pads at the doors and maybe even pavement embedments to make it visually obvious where those doors are on those platforms.
And just quickly, this is a DT from SDOT. I think I would love for our agencies to get together to develop a unified standard, because we're building a lot of the rapid ride bus, especially Madison BRT, for example, which is level boarding and is philosophically equivalent to a light rail in terms of its operation. So we're not sort of, again, going in different directions, and really start to establish sort of unified. And then that would allow us to then have a conversation about what happens when there are bike lanes next to sidewalks, or if there's a raised cycle track and bus stops separated by cycle tracks, and really just have one central standard. Would be really great.
Used to be you could hear a bicycle coming because they'd go click, 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 and you could hear a car coming. Well, now we have not only stealth cars that are electric and you can't hear the darn things until you're under them, but we have massive outbreaks of voluntary deafness because people have their headphones in, and voluntary tunnel vision, or olfactory vision, because their noses are stuck in their smartphones and they can't see anything. Has Wayfinding got plans for adapting with the changes in how people interact or no longer interact with the city around them?
It's an important point, of course, and a lot of our work is about exploration. We often talk about how we can use information to remove a barrier to exploration in a city, and Seattle is a good example that the average tourist, and the first time I came here and I live in Vancouver, I went to the Seattle Centre and Pike Place Market and Pioneer Square and went home. And in Vancouver, similarly, it's Stanley Park, and you do the convention centre, and then you go home, and not many people go to Yaletown, which is probably the nicest part of downtown, or to First Hill here. So I think a lot of what we try to do is to make people look up by exploring their city, and that's why a lot of our projects, in fact most of our projects, are map-based projects, because we inherently are site-based creatures. We internalize and perceive the world in that sort of way in the main, and we have that sort of spatial sense. So I think we can't avoid the fact that we are almost biologically attached to our cell phones now. But what we are trying to do is to make people, to provide the information, to give people another perspective. I don't think we've got an answer for sort of silent cars and those sorts of problems in the street. There's only so much we can do, but certainly what we can do is to provide information that helps you enjoy a place more, and I think that's that's as important as getting you somewhere efficiently, for sure.
So many people are reliant on the visual and the auditory, and a lot of these wayfinding tools do depend on those, and that's a barrier for people that are deaf and blind. And when we talk about mapping, is it tactile mapping or just visual mapping? So those visual maps are really useless to us. So it's important to consider those aspects as well as you develop those tools.
Just really quickly, I think about sort of the silent cars, and I think it comes down to elevating the base design standard for streets to make safer pedestrian and non-vehicle environments, and really create that sort of reducing speeds, parallel efforts for safety and comfort. And I think at least my group within SDOT is trying more and more to think about how to create these legible, more people-oriented spaces. And of course, we've learned a lot from Bell Street, for example, and projects that have tried to do that but not gone the full way. And so it's a process of learning to create really inclusive environments as we do that.
Trying to be consistent across the board, like Metro, Sounder, we're all not just in Seattle. And I think it's also about having those conversations with our jurisdictions. And I think about the international signs for accessibility, like with the wheelchair logo. How do we put some pressure on the ADA or whoever to have some standards so that it's easier to go to jurisdictions and say, look, we need to have this type of paver with this type of textile on it. When we can do that, it makes our jobs a little bit easier to make that happen. Because I can imagine trying to go to some of our jurisdictions saying, hey, we want to upgrade the bus shelters and we want to have this, sidewalk now that has this in here, and who's going to pay for that? I know Seattle might be able to do it, but I can't imagine that some of our other areas, Seattle first should put in the rest of the sidewalks. That's what I advocate first. I think those are some issues that we would need to have a larger advocacy effort around.
Well, Gunnar, thank you for ending us on a call to action. So that's wonderful. We are out of time, so we can just give another round of applause to all the speakers.